The next item on our agenda today is to evidence on the cost effectiveness of Scottish public inquiries. And I'm pleased that we are being joined by Ross Greer, who had the difficult job of being in two places at once this morning, but it's great that he's with us for this session. This is our first evidence session on inquiry, and as stated, our aim is to foster greater understanding of the current position with public inquiries in Scotland, enhance clarity around the purpose, framework and decision-making process for establishing public inquiries and their terms of reference, and ascertain if public inquiries deliver value for money. We will also look to identify any examples of good practice or alternatives to the current model. However, we will not make recommendations on the merits or otherwise of individual Scottish Government decisions on whether to hold a specific public inquiry or recommendations made by individual public inquiries. For this session, I'm delighted to welcome to the meeting Professor Sandy Cameron, CBE. Professor Cameron, we have your fascinating and thought-provoking written submission, so we'll move straight to questions. And I have to say, your submission is a bit of a showstopper. It's short, sharp and certainly to the point, so let's get into it. One of the things that you've said is that in terms of inquiries, you can confidently predict that they will last longer than anticipated and cost more than budgeted for. Why do you feel that this is the case, that they always seem to overrun both in cost and time?
I think that's based on the evidence that you've had in your papers in terms of inquiries that have been set up and how long they have taken to run, and in the budget. And when I was asked before the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry began to do some preparation with colleagues in the Scottish Government, that was one of the things I said, was that you think you can be almost certain that the inquiry will last longer than you think it's going to last, and it will cost more than you think it's going to last. Why that is the case? Perhaps because we don't have a mechanism for striking a balance between ensuring the independence of inquiries, but equally putting a focus on how our costs to be contained and constrained.
Yes, I mean, one of the things you've actually said, in terms of the Jersey inquiry, which you were directly involved in, the cost was estimated at some 6 months, and at the end it sat for, it was supposed to last 6 months and cost £6 million, and it actually cost 23 million in 2 years, so 4 times longer and 4 times more expensive. And what you went on to say is the cost levels in many ways also the result of difficulty in managing the legal costs and holding the solicitors to the inquiry to the budget. So to what extent do you feel legal representatives are motivated to keep the cost to a minimum within budget?
I think the way that legal colleagues work is very much on the basis of doing what they believe they need to do, rather than looking at how do they contain cost and managing costs. So the expectation is this needs to be done, we will do it, and we will keep going and doing that. And a reluctance really to look at other ways that we might have done it, other ways that we could have contained costs, because to some extent this is about the way that we always practice. And I think one of the questions that I would have is, can we find alternative ways of doing this that would manage the costs more effectively and deliver more rapidly for people? Because one of the problems, I think, is when you have inquiries that last for a very long time, then the public lose interest in them. They lose sight of the inquiry. Particularly for inquiries with victims or survivors involved in them, then there is the issue of how long it feels for them that this is taking to get to a conclusion. So you look at the inquiries, Jersey was long at 2 years, but other inquiries have taken much longer than that and are continuing to take longer than that.
I mean, a number of things there in your answer. I mean, first of all, in terms of motivation, are firms actually motivated to actually limit costs? Because it seems to be that it's almost... there seems to be no real incentive for them to actually do so.
I don't think there is an incentive for costs to be limited. I think it's set up in that quasi-judicial way with firms there to do, and they do a very good job in many cases. They have expertise and what have you. But the focus is not on how are we going to contain the costs of this. It's, if it has to be done, it has to be done, and that's the cost. So there are models about other ways that elements of the inquiries could be undertaken by people who might not be so costly to do them? What would the options be there? And how can the cost be constrained?
I mean, I think independence is fundamental. So is justice not only being done, but being seen to be done. But is justice done if an inquiry takes 5, 10, 15 years? I mean, some of the survivors of an instance may not actually still be alive after 5 or 10 or 15 years. And so one wonders whether the frustration of waiting to see justice delivered, you know, perhaps has a very deleterious effect upon them.
I'm sure it does. I think people have often waited a long time for their day, for the inquiry to be set up. Once it's set up, they, I think, have high expectations that this is going to resolve issues for them. They want their voice to be heard, and that's important. But if that then goes on for a long time beyond that, then I think it may well kind of simply add to the kind of sense of we're not being heard or understood. It's got lost sight of. And as you say, there is the risk, particularly where you're talking about inquiries into quite historic issues, as was the case in Jersey, then you're talking about a population of witnesses who may be quite elderly, quite frail, and who are not going to see the end of the inquiry. So I think that is an issue for us when we're dealing with inquiries, about how can we make them kind of sharply focused to get to the point for people, so that they don't drag on forever.
Yeah, I mean, the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry has already cost over £95 million and been going for 9 or 10 years. So, I mean, that's clearly an issue of concern. Now, yeah, you have actually made some suggestions, for example, in terms of something which could be an alternative. I should say, of course, that people who demand inquiries are looking for a judge-led inquiry, often because they say it is the gold standard. What you've said, though, in your evidence is that witnesses, either individual or in small groups, when meeting around a small table with a panel to give their evidence, where lawyers are not involved, it's much less formal, less intimidating, but nonetheless added considerably to the information the panel was able to take into account. So that is, in your view, probably a more expeditious, less expensive, and probably for the people giving evidence, less kind of daunting prospect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Scottish inquiry is now nearly 10 years, and I don't know that there's any kind of sign of it coming to an end. So there is a bit, how long does that go on for? What we had in Jersey was the opportunity to try out a different way of dealing with gathering evidence. A substantial part of the inquiry was in the fairly traditional format, with statements having been taken, counsel to the inquiry, questioning witnesses, the panel questioning witnesses in a quasi-courtroom setting. For the final part of the inquiry, however, we tried out, and our view was that it worked, having a meeting in a much smaller room, round a table, a bit smaller than this, but in many ways similar to what you're doing here. We're having a conversation about this with people, not necessarily just on their own, but sometimes in smaller groups, to have an opportunity for a conversation about their views, about their experience, about what they thought. And we did that in public, with the public being able to kind of sit round the table, behind the table, so that it was still in a public environment, but it was quite close and it felt quite intimate, and people felt quite comfortable with having the conversations that they did. And we were able to gather the information that way without, if you like, the panoply of all the legal process and the statements and the way that the courtroom setting works.
I mean, also, when inquiries have completed their deliberations, I think one area of frustration is, of course, that the report can take donkey's years to write. I mean, what you've said is that, you know, that you tried in your report, which still took a year, that you agreed that we'd try to make it as short as possible in terms of the number of recommendations, and therefore there were 8. So are you suggesting that when inquiries are made, I mean, some inquiries have as many as 86, some have only had 1 recommendation, that they should try to make those recommendations, as, for want of a better word, as punchy and as kind of impactful as possible?
Yes, I see some inquiries, the reports run to several volumes, and you kind of think, well, there's a question of who's going to read that. Yeah. What happens with it? In Jersey, the volume of the report came in 3 sections, one that kind of set out the basis of the inquiry. Then there was quite a large volume that basically contained the evidence that had been heard, and then a shorter final document that contained the findings and the recommendations. And we've determined that what we should do in that document is write it in clear terms, in simple terms, and be quite specific about the recommendations and why we were making the recommendations. But that they should be kept to as small a number as we could in terms of the things that we reached a conclusion would make a difference in that particular jurisdiction in terms of what had happened in the past. And we also made a final recommendation out with the 8 that the panel should go back in 2 years to look at progress against the recommendations. Because one of our concerns is that inquiries sit for a long time, they write voluminous reports, they make recommendations, and then what happens to the recommendations? What do we know about were those recommendations actually the right recommendations? Do we research that? Were they implemented? Were they implemented fully? What were the reasons for them not being there? Of course, inquiries make recommendations. Government or other parties may not accept those recommendations, but they need to be clear why they're not going to accept them and what that's about. So what we did in Jersey was we made that recommendation. That was accepted by the Chief Minister in Jersey, and we went back after 2 years. We met for 2 weeks. We visited a lot of people. We heard from a whole range of people about what their thoughts and views were, and then we produced speedily after that quite a short report on the progress that had been made or not been made. And in Jersey, some of the recommendations had been implemented or were in the process of being implemented. Some recommendations were still quite far away in terms of getting there. Now, one of the issues with that was that many of the victims and survivors, in particular, who had been concerned with this, asked if we would go back again in another 2 years. We took the view that we shouldn't do that because there had to be a point at which the states of Jersey took responsibility on its own and delivered that. But I suspect that we would have been very welcomed by them if we'd gone back after another 2 years and then maybe another 2 years. So there is that challenge in it. But I do think that there needs to be some process, some mechanism for following through on recommendations as part of identifying whether there was value for money in this inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was of great interest to me, the fact that you actually did follow through in terms of recommendations going back 2 years, because I think you're absolutely right. What we seem to see from some inquiries is years and years and years taking evidence. A report published, is in something published in the media, the government might make a statement in Parliament, and then that's it. You know, whether the recommendations are delivered or not and over what timescale is a real issue. So the government may say we will accept these recommendations, but then a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there's not we will accept them and implement them by date X. I think is a real issue. And again, it goes back to justice for the people for whom the inquiry was set up in the first place. Because inquiries sometimes, as you'll be aware, will be set up sometimes by governments who think they're under pressure, you know, and they think this is a good way of kicking things into touch, perhaps. I would suggest. But I was quite amazed that you seem to be the only one that's actually followed through that kind of process, and that's really an issue that you know, jumped out from your statement. So did many other things. I mean, another thing that you pointed out was you said the first UK inquiry was held into the death of a foster child, Dennis O'Neill, 1945, chaired by Sir Walter Monckton, and it commenced in March, reported in May. The report was 15 pages long, and the recommendations you made have been repeated in every child care inquiry since then. And what you're basically saying is that, you know, what we'll have is a kind of reinvention of the wheel in terms of some of these inquiries, whereby recommendations made some 80 years ago, which would probably still have some validity now, have still not really been implemented.
Yes, I think often we hear from victims and from others that we need this inquiry so that lessons will be learned and this will never happen again. Sadly, when you look at the history of particularly child protection inquiries, child abuse inquiries, you find over and over again the same issues coming up about failure to do certain things, failure of communication, not looking deeply enough at issues. So those factors come up over and over again. So it raises the question about how well do we actually learn the lessons from inquiries? And it is the case that some of the things that Monkton said all that time ago in terms of a very early child protection inquiry, it was the death of a child in foster care that he was looking into, are still coming up over and over again. So I do think we need to think carefully about, do we actually learn the lessons, and is there a reason if we don't?
Yeah, yes, and I mean, and also we should be learning the lessons from other jurisdictions, one would think as well, because I mean, obviously these kind of issues happen in other places at other times, and one would have thought looking at what's actually happening elsewhere might be better than kind of starting afresh on every single occasion.
Well, I think a couple of things in that. I mean, I think in some jurisdictions there are differences. I understand that in Scandinavian countries there will be different processes that mean that things are dealt with differently and more speedily. I think when you look at the information in your background papers about the COVID inquiries, it's striking about what's happened in other jurisdictions in terms of how long their inquiry has taken and what it's caused by comparison with what's happening in the UK and in Scotland. So that raises questions about are our much more expensive inquiries more effective, or are other jurisdictions able to do these things equally effectively?
I mean, one of the things you talk about is in the Jersey inquiry, there were 2 solicitors required to involve considerable hourly rates. Now, in the Scottish COVID inquiry, senior counsel was capped at some £200 an hour, with around 40 hours a week, but possibly 60. That could effectively range for that individual from £8,000 to £12,000 a week. But so far, the Scottish COVID inquiry has cost £34 million and is still ongoing, and the UK one £164 million. So that's a lot of hours for lawyers, is it not?
It's a lot of hours. And in Jersey, because of that jurisdiction, and Jersey obviously is a small place, so it didn't have a whole lot of resource, we had to do quite a lot of the legwork at the start of the inquiry as the panel. And what Jersey set that up as a panel was with a chair, Francis Oldham, QC, now KC, who was a very experienced barrister, and Alison Leslie, my colleague, and I sitting as the panel members. But we had to do a lot of the work to set this up. At that early stages, we had to appoint solicitors to the inquiry. We interviewed a number of companies, and part of that process was negotiating the fees down as low as we could, because we were aware of what these would amount to. Counsel is expensive. Counsel in Jersey was in the order of that £200 an hour that we were paying for senior counsel and junior counsel to the inquiry. And then once you're into it, what we were finding was that solicitors to the inquiry were saying, well, no, the statements need 2 people, one to be basically asking the questions and another one to be writing the basis of the statement that would then go put in place. So the statements then go backwards and forwards. So there's a lot of process goes on, all of which costs money, because all of it is being done on the basis of billable hours. So you're then into that dilemma of how do you control the billable hours? How do you say to a solicitor, you've spent too much time doing that, when they say, oh, but this is the time that it took, it needed to be done. So, and that's where you get into those difficult dilemmas about ensuring independence, ensuring it's been done properly, but equally saying, does it really need to be this way? Could we find other ways of doing it?
I mean, the Sheiko Bio report so far is £17 million, I believe, in legal fees alone, and even if it was £200 an hour, that'd be 85,000 hours.
Yes.
If it was for senior counsel, and they're not all senior counsel, so eyebrows certainly have been raised over the costs of these inquiries. And if we compare it elsewhere, you know, Australia are not greatly different from the UK, one would have thought, in many areas. Their COVID inquiry took 13 months and cost £4 million. For example, New Zealand's is ongoing. It's been ongoing for 2 years, but 7 million so far, so it's a lot less in Scotland. And Norway and Sweden, Finland have all concluded theirs within about a year or so. So there are ways in which this can be done more efficiently and effectively. I mean, you talked about an inquisitorial approach, for example, but could there also be a more standardised approach to the practicalities in terms of start-up time and reduced costs? We've already heard about the Caldwell case. It's taken some 13 months after it was announced before it's been set up. So that's over a year. That family's had to wait day in, day out, wondering when that's going to happen. And we also are aware that the Eljamel case spent over £1 million before even any evidence has been heard.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a need to look at, could we set up some sort of structure, some sort of unit that could be the starting point for inquiries, so that everything was ready, so you didn't have to kind of reinvent the wheel for every inquiry. With that, that was one of the considerations when the work that was led by my colleague in terms of working with the universities to look at expert views on this Alison Leslie, was we had hoped that we might get to a point of being able to argue a case that a unit could be set up, perhaps in the university or elsewhere, that could form the basis of supporting inquiries, training people to do that, to get over that initial period of time. Because as you say, that can take a long time to get underway. There's all the setting up. There are a lot of practicalities about premises, about document management systems, documents. Jersey had well over 1 million documents to deal with. Other inquiries will have much larger amounts. You've got the arrangements for transcription, lots of practical things that the public don't see that need to be put in place behind the scenes. Now, much of that, I think, could probably be standardised. You could have a kind of ready-made approach to it, but also part of it has to be what's the model going to be. The model that we've got of the judge-led inquiry, whilst we would say it is inquisitorial, the reality is that it tends to be adversarial, because that's the way that people in that environment work. Could we find an inquisitorial way that would be much more interrogative in terms of trying to find out what happened, and perhaps do that much more speedily with it. In terms of just going back to the issue about going back to review recommendations, one of the issues is that when the inquiry is finished, it no longer has status. But we were able to kind of get around that and say, well, irrespective of that, in Jersey, we will go back. We don't need if you like, the powers to summons witnesses and documents. We're beyond that with it. So I think those kind of issues that get thrown up can be resolved. If we've got the will, we can resolve those issues and say, let's do it differently. Let's try things out differently and see if it works.
My degree was in economics. I love to read the phrase opportunity costs when I actually see a submission, the actual fact. And you've raised a really important point in terms of that, because people see the cost. The cost in Scotland, you know, has been 230 million in public inquiries, UK 1.5 billion. But that's only the kind of, you know, the above the surface kind of costs, if you like. Inquiries can be like an iceberg. You only see the bit above the surface. And you've talked about the hidden costs for participants, such as local authorities, redaction, preparing documents, also for participants in terms of finance, staff time. You're also talking about, you know, the emotional impact on people who are giving evidence, etc. And that is not just the victims or alleged victims, but also people who are, from a professional point of view, having to give evidence to that. We understand that in at least one of the inquiries that we've been looking at, the actual real costs, if you want to call it that, are double what the stated costs are because of these opportunity costs. And if that's got to come out of a particular public service like local government, that's not being spent on public services if the money's having to be redirected into the cost of an inquiry. So do you think there's a way in which these hidden costs can be brought more into the public domain so that people can see what the true impact of these inquiries is?
I think it would be important if inquiries reported on what the total costs were of everything that was involved in the inquiry. When I was doing the briefing and preparation for the Scottish inquiry, I also did some work with local authorities to say, you need to get ready for this. This is going to take you time. You will need to be looking at documents, files, historic files. You'll be needing to look at redaction for those. The services need to devote staff time to that. So there is a cost that goes on. And if the inquiry is going on for a long time, then that cost goes on in terms of a never-accruing cost to people. And the other aspect of the opportunity cost is, in terms of the total costs, what might we have done in relation to the issue that the inquiry is looking into? In Jersey, for instance, one of the things that at the start of the inquiry that I was doing was going around and meeting various organisations to tell them about the inquiry and what we were going to expect from them. And I was conscious at that time that at that point the inquiry was expected to cost £6 million. But I was meeting organisations in Jersey in the third sector who were having their budgets cut. So that felt, frankly, awkward for me as a former director of social work to be saying, yes, we're going to be having this inquiry, it's going to cost all this money to do it, it's important, we need to do it, but actually you're potentially having to shut down services. So there's that difficult balance, I think, to think through in terms of what the opportunity costs are.
I'm just going to ask one last question, because colleagues are keen, obviously, to come in, understandably. So, I mean, you've said basically that on that issue there's a need to examine ways in which cost inquiries can be contained without being seen to compromise independence. And you've said that could they be expected to work to set budgets and timetables as opposed to the somewhat open-ended arrangements which pertain at present and which too often result in escalating costs. But surely they should, absolutely, because I can't think of any other area of government where, for example, there's an open-ended timescale or budget. You know, I mean, you don't set a capital contract and just say, well, just take as long as you like and spend as much as you want. I mean, I know that's not said implicitly, but it's almost explicitly, almost implicitly, I should say. No one says that, but that's almost the way it appears to be if one looks at how inquiries are rolled out. I mean, for example, the Vale of Leaving inquiry, the Health Secretary at the time said, I'm looking for a report within 15 months, and the judge said, well, we'll do it as soon as possible, which turned out to be over 5 years. So do you believe that there should, in actual fact, be parameters in terms of cost and timescale like there is for any other area, for example, the public sector?
I think you should certainly look at how could you set parameters and hold inquiries to account in terms of delivering to that. And that's not to say that you might say, we want this report by this time. And it may well be that issues have emerged, that there is a case to be made out about why it needs to be extended. But at least there would then be a reference back and a process for agreeing that there would be an extension of the timescale, rather than the current situation where they just go on for as long as they want to go on.
There's also an issue, of course, of a conflict of interest when legal firms that are directly involved in a specific inquiry are themselves suggesting perhaps a deepening and widening of that inquiry. Would you agree to that?
I think that's one of the challenges. I don't know that this happens consciously, but I do think there is a bit that says, what interest is there in legal firms kind of saying, let's do this more quickly, let's cut this down, let's quicker, as opposed to there's more, because you can always say there is more that we need to look at, let's look at this aspect. So I do think there needs to be a very clear kind of discipline focused on, we're not going to go down that route, we're dealing with what we're dealing with. Some of that needs to be, I think, embodied into the terms of reference at the outset, be quite clear about what it is that the inquiry is to look at, because inquiries can kind of diverge, grow arms and legs a bit, I think, into other areas, and that extends the timescale. And there are few people who are involved in it likely to be saying, can we cut this down? Can we slow this down?
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, it's whet the appetite of colleagues around the table. The first to ask questions will be Michelle, followed by John.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. And I think I too was very intrigued by your submission, and I think it's worthwhile quoting one sentence that jumped out because it's quite compelling. It has to be recognised that inquiries are a source of substantial income for some large legal firms, and as such the question arises as to the extent to which they are motivated to keep costs to a minimum and within budget. I think that's a very, very powerful sentence. And I looked up your kind of background in readiness for this, and obviously you've got a very long and compelling hinterland. Is there any other arena that you've dealt with through the source of your career where there is no cost control whatsoever when we're dealing with millions of pounds? The terms of reference don't ordinarily contain budget. There's no stage gates, if you like, or phasing of the inquiry. There's no active monitoring. Have you ever come across that in any other walk of life in your career?
No, I haven't. I think this is something that you are aware of in terms of the legal processes, that this is how it works, and that once you embark into that, you've got no real way of knowing what the costs are going to be. That worries me in terms of it can be a reason not to engage in some of the legal process because the worry about cost. But I think, particularly in terms of inquiries, then they are set up and then they become open-ended. One of the things that you might look at is when the Bloody Sunday inquiry went on. That went on for a very, very long time and cost a great deal of money. But it was said in that lawyers are expensive. They're very expensive. That was a quote from Lord Savile, who chaired that inquiry, who was very resistant to the idea that he should curtail the inquiry or stop it. But it was simply, that's the way it is. And if you want me to do the job, then that's what it will be.
Yeah. And in terms of going back to a comment that the convener made earlier, we've seen examples where lawyers acting on behalf of clients make the call for a public inquiry in the media, and it can be very sort of vigorous. Now, one can take a view that the lawyers are doing the right thing for their clients, or you could also take the view that they understand that the opening of a public inquiry then means that their costs are going to be covered by the government of the day. What are you aware of in terms of, and I know your experience was with Jersey, but are you aware of any checks and balances in that process at all, where people think, but wait a minute, if this action goes to a public inquiry, it's a licence in effect to print money. Were you subjected to checks and balances, or was it you yourself that was putting the checks and balances in place?
I think we were putting the checks and balances in place. We were very conscious that this was because of the experience of the other panel members, that this was something that could end up costing a lot of money. So we did our very best to try and constrain the costs. Arguably, we failed miserably in terms of the fact that the initial kind of figure that had been worked out by a firm of consultants in terms of what they thought would need to happen turned out to be far from the truth. And we had a very difficult process in having to say to the Chief Minister in Jersey, this is going to cost more. And basically you're in a corner now because you can't really say, no, we're not going to fund it. Yeah. Having started, you can't say, well, wrong idea, let's pull back from that with it. So I think there is that bit. I think in terms of there are clearly lawyers in Scotland who are very important in terms of ensuring that people are properly represented, that their cases are heard. But underlying it all, there is a business aspect to it as well, I think. And we need to acknowledge and recognise that, particularly if we're thinking of, is there another way to do this? Because there will be resistance to other ways of doing it. Yeah. So I think we need to be alert to that fact in looking at, could we do inquiries differently so they would cost less and could be delivered more speedily.
Okay. And in terms of the inquiry you were dealing with, how much pressure were you coming under from government there to keep a lid on costs, or how much active monitoring was there from them? Or again, was that you pointing that out? You mentioned that you had to go back and say, look, costs are going to increase.
We were not put under pressure by the States of Jersey, in all fairness to them. We were having conversations with them about the costs. They were anxious about the costs, and we were doing our best to manage those with that. But I think, again, when it comes to that balance between pressure from government and the need for independence, because if you are seen to be pressured by government, then particularly in inquiries where there are victims, they will end up kind of feeling that justice has not been done. That this is just... and in Jersey there was a lot of suspicion. They had this thing that was often said in Jersey about the Jersey way, that believed there was a kind of conspiracy against people. So you had to be very clear, and the Chief Minister was very clear from the outset that nobody from Jersey had to be involved in the inquiry, so that it would be seen to be independent. So that was a real strength, but it highlights, I think, what some of the dilemmas can be.
And so presumably within that there was kind of active consideration of where potential of, say, conflict of interest might occur. What people say about Scotland, and I imagine it's similar in Jersey, is the good thing about Scotland is everybody knows everybody. The bad thing about Scotland is everybody knows everybody. But it sounds like that Jersey was very aware about the potential for conflict of interest where there was existing relationships that might be mutually beneficial.
Yes, and I think that was, they were very conscious that that was the fact. Now, Jersey is a population of just over 100,000. It's 9 miles by 5 miles, so it's, people do know one another, and they do recognise one another. It's got very different structures of the way that things work. So it was absolutely right that the Chief Minister at the outset, in appointing the panel, who were all from outside Jersey, was very clear that he wanted nobody from Jersey to be involved in the running of the inquiry. We had a liaison person from the States of Jersey, but we... interestingly, after kind of the first week, one of the victim witnesses said, "What's he doing here?" With that, because they recognised who he was and what he did. And we made sure from then on that he was not kind of in the premises other than when he had to be. So it can be as sensitive as that. Scotland's much bigger, but in the arena of these inquiries, people will know one another.
It's about the principle.
Yes.
And you make comment in your submission about the further costs of redacting statements and allude to the fact that they're very expensive. I think it would be useful, given that we're just at the start of this inquiry, if you could set out why it is that they're so expensive. Is it simply about time and the concept of time online?
It's about time of going through documents and identifying what needs to be redacted in documents, because you obviously have to be sensitive to documents that are going to end up in the public domain, about what's in there that can't be included in it. So redaction is quite a long, slow process of going through, because you need to be sure that it's all been checked with that. Now, if that's being done by solicitors on hourly rates, then that's high. So the question arises, can other people do the redaction? Can they be trained to do the redaction? But it is an important element. You don't want information to get into the public domain that could present a hazard to somebody in there. So it's an important element of it. But it's not something that people, I think, tend to be familiar with as part of what goes on in an inquiry.
And, I mean, you've mentioned the term, and I think the convener did as well, in terms of the concept of billable hours. I mean, there really isn't any other kind of walk of life where you would go into something and it would be charged out on a billable hours basis without some attempt at negotiation of fixed costs up front, particularly where they're going to be significant. Is this just precedent because that's the way lawyers like to operate?
It's the way it works. I don't know. You'll need to ask lawyers now about that. I think maybe there is more pressure from clients these days to look for a fixed price. Can you do that? I think it would be very difficult probably to get that done in an inquiry. So I think the issue is really about the negotiation that you can get the rates down. We used the Treasury rates as the kind of baseline for that to get them down as low as they could with it. But it's a contentious issue.
Okay, and I've just got one last wee question. One of our people who gave evidence commented about the unintended impact of what was called the Maxwellisation process, where it referred to somebody in the report that they had the opportunity to have early sight and to seek modifications. To what extent do you think that ultimately could potentially affect be another one of the potential effects on outcome if somebody has the chance to
the Maxwellisation process, which is there as a safeguard for people who've given evidence, is important. But again, it's a process that can take quite a long time.
Therefore, money.
For that. I don't think it's something that should affect the findings or the recommendations. What it will do is potentially reflect what the evidence is that's summarised in the report.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Liz.
Thanks, Convener. And I'll maybe start by declaring an interest in that I'm a chartered accountant. So we also I think we do charge by hour, some of my colleagues. But I was going to draw the kind of comparison because a company's accounts have to be audited. And I think most people would say that, yes, auditors get it wrong at times, but they are independent. And yet the financial arrangements are very, very different. And I mean, there's a legal requirement that financial accounts are submitted, usually within 9 months or thereabouts, and they have to be audited. And I think in the case of banks, it's even quicker than that. So, I mean, coming from that background, maybe I'm biased, but, you know, do you think there's some scope in there, as there would be for an audit, which is still independent? Because you talked about this balance between independence and controls.
Yeah.
You know, is there some that the legal side of things could learn from the accountancy side of things?
I would have thought so. I would have thought if there's an audit process, it at least raises questions about why that expenditure was necessary. And I think expenditure should be justified in it, rather than simply this is the way we do it.
I mean, is it a different mindset? Because again, you said, if I got it correctly, if it has to be done, it has to be done. Whereas within the accountancy profession, you know you've got a month to do the very best you can. And I think that would apply to others. I mean, the cleaners in this building do the best they can in 8 hours. The cooks in the canteen do the best they can in a set amount of time. So it's a different kind of mindset. Is that, I mean, at times I just wonder, is that impossible to change?
I'm not sure how easy it is to change the way if you like, the legal profession work. I think the question then is, are there other ways that the inquiry might operate? Does it all need to be on that basis? Some of it may well need to be, but there may well be other ways that it can work in terms of people who do interviews, who do elements of the investigation that would cost less. Yeah.
And the idea that it's got to be judge chaired, and we seem to have got into this position that there's a kind of hierarchy. Yeah. And, you know, if it was a politician, well, that wouldn't be very good chairing it. But if it was if it's a judge, well, that's the gold standard, and therefore everyone wants that. I mean, it's a bit difficult to unwind that, isn't it?
Well, I think we've got now a kind of, if you like, public perception, a media perception that if there has been an issue, it should be an inquiry and it should be judge-led. So that said, I don't know there's an awful lot of thinking goes on behind why does it need to be a judge-led. And of course, it doesn't legally require to be led by a judge. And indeed, the inquiry, the UK inquiry into child sexual abuse was chaired by Professor Alexis Jay, a social worker, with that. So it can be done by other people and bring a different perspective to it. I have worked alongside judges in the Parole Board and other places. I've got great respect for them, but they do operate in a particular way because that's where they've been trained, that's the environment that they operate in, and perhaps they are going to be less comfortable with saying, let's find another way of doing this with it. But I think we need to be really raising the question about why does every inquiry need to be judge-led. There's an opportunity cost in that in terms of the number of judges now in Scotland, or retired judges who are tied up in inquiries going on for a long period of time.
So it might be, I mean, you in your case with Jersey, you were kind of expert in that field, yes, as I understand it, but you were from outside, obviously. Yeah. So presumably, well, I would have thought that there's quite an argument, if something's a very specialised area like medical, that there would be a strong argument for having a very medical person in charge rather than a legal person.
Yes, I mean, there's an argument for that about who would be the best person for this terms of reference to chair this inquiry. What would they bring to it? I think the other element of it is the question of whether the Jersey model, as has happened with the ICSA in London, where there's somebody chairing it, but there's also a panel with different expertise in it. So in Jersey, the inquiry was chaired by Francis Oldham, KC, who also had experience sitting as a judge, but was a defence barrister in the main. But she had a panel of the other two of us who were both from a social work background. And we worked together. And in fact, when it came to questioning witnesses, probably the important role that we played was to question witnesses based on our experience and our expertise.
So that was 3 in the panel, is that correct? Was that did that in retrospect, was that good, or would 5 been better, or?
No, I think 3 was sufficient. It meant that we were able to work as a unit. If you add more and more people onto it, then I think you just kind of add complication to it. But it also meant that we had a group who we could if you like, divvy the work up between in terms of the day-to-day management of the inquiry and when it came to writing the report.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, there's well, one of the points that's raised, I think, by somebody else is that, you know, there's people are hoping to get different things out of a public inquiry, but the victims or the families or the survivors or that kind of group are obviously key to the whole thing, and they're obviously often the ones that are demanding a public inquiry. Is your experience, or do you know, are they normally satisfied? I mean, Jersey would be an example. Are these people, on the whole, satisfied with the public inquiry when we get to the end of it?
I think the answer to that question is no, we don't know, and we should know. I think we need to do more in terms of asking people who have been victims or survivors, who have been witnesses, whether at the end of the day, did they feel that justice had been done, had their voice been heard. I think often people feel that if they have their day at the inquiry, that will bring closure for them. And unfortunately, quite often it doesn't bring closure. And in other cases, it brings back the issues that have been looked at. So there needs to be proper support for people who end up distressed as a result of giving evidence. So I think we don't know enough about that from them.
I mean, it sometimes seems to me that you see people on TV or wherever, and you know you get the result of the inquiry, but they're very open that they're not satisfied with it. I mean, whether sometimes people are wanting revenge, they're wanting somebody's head to roll, and if that doesn't happen,
yes, and I think that's where somebody said you've got to be clear with people about what the inquiry is about, what's going to happen. I think victims and survivors want their voice to be heard, and they want to be believed. You can't say we're going to believe everything you say because we need to test that out. But essentially, they want to be in an environment where their voice is heard and they're believed. I think they want to understand what has gone wrong in the past. And there is undoubtedly an element where they want to arguably apportion blame, but perhaps more positively, they want to be able to attribute responsibility with that. And they need to feel that those objectives have been achieved for them. And I think we don't test out sufficiently regularly whether that has been achieved by people. In Jersey, at an informal level, when we asked people after we published the report, the victims, the main kind of people who had been calling for the inquiry, indicated that they were satisfied, not least of all because we had made recommendations about things that they had not expected we would touch in that environment. They thought they won't do that, and we did. Yes. And in many ways that was important for people.
And I mean, maybe I should know that, but I mean, was blame part of the thing that you kind of concluded on, which, as you just said, some people are expecting, or is that vary amongst public inquiries? Some would attribute blame and some wouldn't.
I think blame is. I think there's an issue about responsibility. I think in our report we would have, and the evidence we would have said, and the questioning we would have said to people, why didn't you do this at the time? You know, so you need to hold people to account for the actions that they took, or the failures that they made with it, or why they behaved in particular ways. So I think it is important that you do that. I think it's not. I think sometimes there is a misconception for people that they would like to see prosecutions, and in the main there's an agreement that there won't be prosecutions based on the evidence in the inquiry.
Yes. And I mean, I don't know what your knowledge is of other countries, but you know, we're hearing like from the Nordic countries doing it much simpler, quicker, and all of that. Have you any idea if the public there are satisfied with that? Or?
No, I don't, but I think that would be one of the things that would be worth finding out.
Yes.
About the perception of why have we got to this stage in Scotland and the UK where we have so many inquiries, so many expensive inquiries and such long inquiries.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. List will be followed by Craig.
Thank you, and Convener, just before I ask my questions, can I just put on the public record that I'm obviously very heavily involved in providing case notes to one of the inquiries, non-pecuniary obviously, which may be used in evidence as that inquiry progresses. Professor Cameron, can I just ask, when it comes to the decision about whether it is a judge-led inquiry or not, To what extent is the main deciding issue about compelling witnesses to appear? Because obviously that has been a concern for many of the victims who've been involved, that they are very keen indeed, rightly so in my opinion, to see specific witnesses compelled to give evidence.
I think that's a feature of it. I think that does not mean that it needs to be a judge who's chairing it. I think there needs to be certainly legal involvement in that process. But I think the power to compel witnesses and to compel documents in many inquiries is an important one, so that people feel that there's no escaping from.
And so do you think the reason for the demand for a judge-led public inquiry tends to be because people believe that that person will have the legal authority and legal standing to be able to get more out of the evidence? Do you think that's...
I think they may do. I think when they're calling for that, they're thinking that this will be like a court. It should be like a court. Whereas perhaps if we have a more inquisitorial model, it can be different, a different kind of environment.
And just in relation to the comment you made in answer to Mr Mason, where you implied that the demand for public inquiries is growing, do you think that one of the reasons for that increase is because public services in the UK, not just in Scotland, are not delivering satisfactory answers when something goes wrong?
I think it's difficult to know why there is that growing demand. It's almost become the automatic response to an issue, is we need an inquiry, we need a public inquiry, and then often that becomes we need a judge-led inquiry, without saying, yes, we need to find out what went wrong, but is there another way that we've got for doing that with it? And often because these things are happening quite long time after the event, then it comes back and it takes a long time to argue that corner. I think, yes, public authorities need to be open about issues that they've got wrong and be able to say that.
Yeah, my own personal view is a personal view, not just because of the inquiry with which I've been involved, but reading extensively about other ones, is that I have a feeling that victims do not feel that there is sufficient accountability within the public authorities. In other words, the reason why we've got a demand for public inquiries is because people are dissatisfied with the lack of accountability in their eyes of different public bodies. And that's a major issue. If that's correct, that is a major issue. And so I wonder, in terms of trying to ensure that there is better accountability, do you think that there should be more government input when it comes to ensuring that whistleblowing is effectively responded to, or should there be other structures within government that can hold some of the bodies to account?
I think it is important to hold bodies to account. And absolutely, I think for people who have been victims or survivors, if it's that type of inquiry, they need to feel that people, if they are still kind of in post, are held to account for the actions that they took. And I think that then is not for the inquiry itself, it's for the inquiry in terms of its report and what it says has gone wrong. It's then for those institutions to decide how they're going to deal with that. And that would be part, I think, of the follow-through.
Yeah, because I really do think this is quite a serious issue at the moment, and it's one of the reasons why we have an increasing demand for specific public inquiries. And actually, I think it's a reason why they are taking longer, because the toing and froing to try to get to the information that is required takes an awful long time, and the costs multiply. Yes. And it's partly the hidden costs as well. Yes. That takes such a long time. You're talking about redaction. That's vitally important in terms of data confidentiality, etc. But I think there is a real issue about the amount of time that it does take when, well, I think there's a frustration about that time, because some of the answers should have been provided before by some of the agencies who have been accused of lack of accountability and taking responsibility. I think that's a major issue. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts as to what we can do to try to improve that.
I think, looking back in my career as a director of social work, my approach was always, if something had gone wrong, we'll deal with it straight away. Sometimes colleagues in other places thought, well, we'll wait until there's an inquiry. My view was that it was better that we had dealt with it kind of internally, taken whatever action was necessary, so that if it came to an inquiry, we were in a position to say, that's been addressed, here's what we did, we found it. So I think there is that bit of process about not letting things sit, but actually being seen to deal with them, and to deal with them openly.
And my last question, in general terms, I don't mean this about any specific inquiry, but do you think there has been an increasing temptation for government, any government, not any particular political colour, to accept a public inquiry because it gets them out of the responsibility of taking decisions that perhaps they should have been?
I think that is certainly the suspicion of many people, is it feels like, as an inquiry, a way of, as I think you, Chairman, said, kicking it into the long grass. Because once an inquiry has been announced, it allows, whether it be in central or local government or wherever, people to say, I can't say anything about this because it's the subject of an inquiry. But then if that inquiry goes on for years, then it kind of moves it away altogether. So it's that bit about how do you kind of keep to the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Craig, to be followed by Michael.
Good morning, Professor Cameron. Thank you for joining us. Just looking back to the use of royal commissions in the past, in the 1970s, I think I counted there were 12, and now they're very, very rare. So presumably, with that form of inquiry, government, parliament, the public weaned themselves off it and found different ways of making those big decisions. Is that the kind of seminal point, tipping point we've got to here, do you think, where we should be looking at something quite fundamental as an alternative to public inquiries?
I think so. I think the fact that you're having this inquiry is really welcome. And I think it's a point of saying, could this lead to rethinking what we do? Is there a different way of doing it? Have we got to a point where we're saying, we can't keep going like this? We need to think about other ways of achieving justice for people, of finding out what went wrong and being sure that we do actually learn the lessons. So I think, yes, this could be an important point.
That point. I hate to dampen your optimism. I think the other problem is, though, that we look back to other parliaments and other public inquiries, they themselves have had a retrospective analysis of other inquiries and identified the shortcomings that we're all identifying here. I think the Thirlwell inquiry looked at past recommendations into healthcare issues and found that many hadn't been acted upon, and then subsequently we see the same happening there. And the Grenfell inquiry recommended a public accessible record of recommendations made by select committees, corners and public inquiries, which government then must use to track the progress of implementation or otherwise explain why it's failed to implement those recommendations. Again, that hasn't happened. And then only last year, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee held an inquiry like this that, again, probably came to some of the same conclusions that I think we will rightly come to. But one element here, and I think you identified it in relation to Jersey, is there is scepticism about government engagement with public inquiries once they're established. But there shouldn't be the similar level of scepticism about parliamentary engagement and oversight. So is that something, now we don't want to make work for ourselves or we don't want to be accused of a power grab, but on the basis of your experience so far, nor do I want to short-circuit our inquiry, but is Parliament perhaps the solution to overcoming some of the problems we see here? So rather than government being in the driving seat, once it's established, Parliament has an oversight and ongoing commitment to observing what's happening.
Yes, I think what's important is that in reviewing what the outcome has been in terms of the recommendations, there needs to be a degree of independence in that. You could argue that Parliament is, in that sense, is independent from government, so it could perhaps have that role. But I think whatever happens, there is a real need to look at what can we put in place that will look at the recommendations and what happened and where they followed through. Because I think that's a major gap that we've got at the present time with inquiries. And as you've highlighted, you see things being repeated over and again, and it's not happened. And I think that then undermines public confidence. If there's still a public interest, because that's the other bit about this, is that if it's gone on for all these years, then the people who may have been fired up at the beginning, over many years, maybe kind of lose track of where we're at.
Yeah. I suppose to go back to that issue about royal commissions, it was a very yes minister, Sir Humphrey Appleby would call for a Royal Commission to get an issue, kick it into the long grass. Is there an element, therefore, we need greater engagement with the public about this, because their first demand is for an inquiry? A judge seems like an independent person, but actually, if you look at the outcome 10 or 15 years later, when nothing happens, people have died, victims are left without answers. So really, should this conversation be more inclusive than it is at the moment, and to level with the public that it isn't working for them?
Yes, I think one of the things is we don't know what the public really think, but particularly we don't really know what the parties or the victims have thought about inquiries. Did it serve their purpose at the end of the day? And there are those gaps in our knowledge because we don't do these things routinely.
Yeah, and just finally, just in terms of this issue in relation to judge-led inquiries, Sir John Sturrock in his evidence to us basically, I think, bemoans the fact there's a judicial detailed forensic approach, which I think he calls overly legalistic and which leads to an adversarial system. It doesn't have to be that way, does it? Presumably we can smash this and start again.
I think you can, as I say, in Jersey it worked very effectively when we were, if you like, in inquisitorial mode, sat round the table with people to have a conversation with them, just as we're having just now. That you can probe, you can ask for more, you can get it there. It doesn't need to be in that very formalised questioning by counsel against a statement that's been made. Because one of the concerns was that process often felt like there had been a process of drawing up a statement that had been expensive and what have you, and then what happened when it came into the hearing room was that basically counsel asked the same questions with it. So it felt like this is process rather than engagement with people. I think people need to feel that they are engaged with and that they are able to tell their story. Because an awful lot about inquiries, particularly our victims, is people need to be able to tell their story.
And just finally, in relation to the kind of mission creep and the budget creep, presumably there would be downsides to setting a limit, a budget, to the inquiry. And what would the negative consequences of that potentially be, based on your experience?
Well, the danger, obviously, is that you curtail the inquiry and you miss out on what is to be there. I think you can set a budget with the opportunity for that budget to be increased, provided that a case is made out for it. So it doesn't just drift on with that. Which to some extent is in effect what happened in Jersey. When the initial budget of £6 million became apparent that wasn't going to be enough, we had to go back and make representations and say this is why, and get that agreed.
That's super, thank you.
Yeah, I should say that New Zealand's investigation into what happened under COVID is a Royal Commission.
Yeah.
And it's chaired by an epidemiologist, and on the panel is a former government minister and a Treasury Secretary rather than a judge, and they have a deadline of February next year to conclude. Michael.
Thank you, Professor Cameron. It's been very stimulating so far and very useful. Can I ask, on the independent Jersey Care inquiry, why did you take on that role?
I thought it would be interesting. I thought I would have something to contribute from my experience. I had been chairman of the parole board for Scotland up until just before that approach was made. Well, I have the opportunity to go and do that. And it was, for me, it was a learning experience. It was a new experience of being in that setting. And it was because of the people we were working with on the panel who had different experiences, then it was a very valuable experience. So it was something that people say to me, that must have been very harrowing. We were dealing with difficult issues. We were hearing difficult evidence, but equally, you felt that you had something to contribute. And when it came to the recommendations, then I think what I was able to do was to apply my experience and to here are the things that need to be done as a result of the failings that there had been in the past.
And do you think it was worthwhile?
I think for Jersey it was worthwhile. I think Jersey needed to move on from the global publicity it had attracted over the Haute Garenne issue. You may remember that this was where it was believed that bodies had been buried under a children's home. At the end of the day, no bodies were found. There was no evidence of that. But Jersey needed to move on not least of all because of the adverse publicity it was attracting to the island, and that was potentially affecting their trade, their business, being the finance world. So from their point of view, it was worthwhile. Certainly for the victims who felt that they hadn't been heard, they were sceptical at the outset. Would we really delve into the issues? Would we really kind of question people? Would we hold them to account? And at the end of the day, when they saw that that's what we did, then they were very positive about that.
Okay. I mean, Jersey's a population of 100,000 people, £23 million. Yeah. I mean, that you mentioned already the budget restraints within social work departments, and you've led social work departments, and at the same time that those people are protecting lives, social workers in those communities, and you were quite conscious of that. Almost, would you call it a trade-off?
Yes, absolutely. I think we were cautious of the cost of this inquiry against the pressures on the budget. People assume that Jersey's a wealthy island. There's a lot of money in Jersey, but they have the same budget constraints in terms of their services. So yes, that was there with it. And I think that's why we particularly felt kind of after the inquiry that we need to revisit some of the work that Alison had begun with SUI, with the Scottish Universities Insight Institute, to look at inquiries and could they be done differently, really on the basis of saying that there has to be a better and more cost-effective way of dealing with these issues.
Okay. And I think, following up on some comments and questions that colleagues have made, it strikes me that there's an issue in here about the design of inquiries. I'll maybe come on to method in a moment, but the government is trying to deal with quite often being pushed into a position where there's a lack of trust around potentially the state's role within, whether it be delivery of a service or delivery of justice within its own way. And they have to find a means by which, quite often under pressure, to try and bring some form of solutions to that question. It strikes me that often that there's a bit of a one-size-fits-all process for all this, not just the judge-led, and we've talked about the tendency towards that we've perhaps become fixated on that side of it, but is it possible that just in different fields there are entirely different approaches that might be appropriate to dealing with some of those issues?
I would have thought so. I think the subject matter will vary, and I think what we need to explore are there different models that fit different purposes. The approach to the Edinburgh Trams inquiry, for instance, would be different from the child abuse inquiry, because the Edinburgh Trams inquiry isn't dealing with victims or survivors as such. It's looking into a whole range of technical and legal issues with that. So that's one type of inquiry. Inquiries where there are victims or people who have been directly affected by it, whether it be child abuse, whether it be something like Sheikh Bao, Emma Caldwell, whatever. These inquiries may well lend themselves to a different approach.
And in the Scottish system at the moment, who do you think designs the public inquiry?
I think probably each inquiry is designed by its chair at the outset with government in terms of agreeing the terms of reference. How is it going to be set up? And I think that's one of the issues is, could we have a more standardised approach to the design of the inquiry and how it will work?
Okay. So you think that is a discussion between the chair once selected. So there must be a process though where, in essence, the government pre-designs the inquiry because they have to appoint the appropriate person, as we described.
Absolutely.
You know, it might be a senior epidemiologist, as the convener suggested, around a COVID inquiry, or it might be a judge if it were in a legal situation. So there's some preconstruction of what will happen from government in that situation.
I think arguably that's where there would be merit in government having if you like, an array of options available to it about what would work best for this situation, rather than the pressure to go in just one route that we've got a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, but rather say, no, for this issue, this is how we will approach it.
Would it not be better perhaps if we had, for instance, a judge-led public inquiry unit that then, once the button was pressed by government, the entire design, including who was to be the chair, the independence of the structure, was to be passed to that group, who might then be the people who were charged with, for instance, your suggestions about once the budget had reached its threshold, if a case were to be made, it went back?
I think there would be merit, in having an inquiry, a public inquiries unit. Whether it needs to be judge-led or not, a moot point. But certainly a body that could look to develop the approach to inquiries, could deal with the mechanics of the inquiries, could help towards standardisation of some of the processes with it. So it says, here is, if you like, your starter for the inquiry.
I suppose what I'm trying to do in my head is to try and make some assumptions about how we deal with this trust issue.
Yes.
The people are looking for a high bar and threshold. My view around this, I think that the decline in trust in public institutions, politicians, is part of the question here that has to be dealt with and that people are seeking recourse for.
Yes, I think that's where you've got to be sure that whatever process is followed is seen to be credible and it's got integrity, and that the public can have faith in the expertise and the integrity of the people who are leading it. So that's really important.
And you mentioned on then around the issue of method, redaction of documents and so on, and that being charged at an hourly rate for potentially huge screeds of evidence, massive volumes. You don't think that some of that work needs to be done by hourly rated solicitors?
I think we could find other people who could do that, who could be trained to do it, would know what they were doing, and could be employed on the basis of saying they are, if you like, redaction officers who will deal with that, at least the first go. There might be a need for some oversight by legal eyes at the end of the day with that, but a lot of these processes could be done by other people.
Okay. Thank you, Camilla. That's me, but if I can set on record as well, in similar case to Liz Smith, my involvement with a public inquiry as a constituency MSP is providing information and testimony in all likelihood to that inquiry.
Okay, thank you. And Liz, you want to come in with a...
Just one very short question. Do you think Parliament needs to look at the 2005 Inquiries Act?
I think that would be part and parcel of looking at what should the future be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I really actually found this fascinating, this opening session. I just wonder if there's anything further you wish to add to the evidence you've provided today before we wind up.
No, I think my only thing would be say to make the changes will not be easy because there will be resistance to it. But I do believe very strongly that bearing in mind the need to satisfy victims, for people to feel that this has been worthwhile, is important, and that anything can be changed. It's possible to change it and say, we don't have to do it that way. Having been Director of Social Work in the Borders, I'm very familiar with the phrase, it's I been. And there's a degree to which that applies here, and it says that it doesn't always have to be this way. We can do it differently.
Yes, I don't think we're pushing an open door, I have to be honest with you, but nevertheless, we shall certainly valiantly pursue our aims. So I want to thank you, Professor Cameron, for your very helpful contribution, for taking the time to speak to the committee and for your excellent submission. We'll continue to take evidence on our inquiry next week. We'll hear from 2 panels of witnesses. That concludes the public part of our meeting. The next item on our agenda, which we'll discuss in private, is consideration of our work programme. So we now move into a private session. I'll just call a 5-minute break to allow broadcasting the official report and Professor Cameron to leave.